What's up guys, Miles here from 9to5Mac, and if you're a fan of good ideas, be sure to subscribe to the channel for future content like this. Today we're going to be doing an overall comparison between the iPad Pro 12.9 with M1 and the brand new Galaxy Tab S8 Ultra. If you're looking to buy one of the most powerful tablets on the market, then this is the comparison you'll want to watch. Starting with the iPad Pro 12.9, you're looking at a 12.9-inch display powered by the Apple M1 chip with either 8GB or 16GB of RAM depending on your storage. This model here is rocking 8GB of RAM, and there's also a 10,700 mAh battery. You've got a dual lens camera setup with an ultra wide and wide angle lens on the back, and then a true depth center stage camera on the front. You've got a quad speaker system, a studio quality mic, and a Thunderbolt port for data and charging. The Tab S8 Ultra is rocking a 14.6-inch display powered by the Snapdragon 8 Gen 1 with either 8, 12, or 16GB of memory, depending on your storage. This model here is rocking the 12GB of RAM, and there's an 11,200 mAh battery inside. You've got a dual lens camera setup consisting of a wide and ultra wide angle camera on the rear, and then you've got a dual lens front camera setup consisting of a wide and ultra wide angle lens as well. And there's also a micro SD card slot, which is pretty rare nowadays, and a USB-C 3.2 port for data and charging. The iPad Pro is powered by the Apple M1 chip, which is a 5nm CPU with 8 cores comprised of 4 performance cores and 4 efficiency cores. You've got a 16-core neural engine and an 8-core GPU, and you've got 8GB of RAM on the 128, 256 and 512GB storage models, and then 16 gigs of RAM on the 1 and 2 TB models. This model I've got in particular is rocking 8GB of RAM. The Galaxy Tab S8 Ultra is powered by the Snapdragon 8 Gen 1 chip, and this is a 4nm CPU with 8 CPU cores, and this CPU is paired with the Adreno 730 GPU. The S8 Ultra's also got either 8GB of RAM with the 128GB storage model, 12 gigs of RAM with the 256 model, and 16 gigs of RAM with the 512GB of storage model. This model I've got here has 12 gigabytes of RAM. Both of these chips are among the kings of ARM-based mobile chips, so the general performance of M1 chip and the Snapdragon 8 are going to be the best you can get for the money. The next step up from these are essentially desktop class processors, which the M1 chip technically is. Geekbench 5 is the most common CPU benchmarking application for getting an idea of how capable a CPU is for specific tasks. And any specific benchmark isn't going to tell the whole story as far as performance between devices, but holy cow is the CPU benchmark score interesting to see. Clearly the iPad Pro is dominating the Snapdragon 8 Gen 1 in both single core and multi-core tests, but the difference in multi-core performance is astronomical. Image processing, text rendering, and tasks like that are done miles faster on the M1 chip. The compute benchmark in Geekbench is used to show off GPU performance for computing tasks, and it's important to keep in mind that the iPad and Tab S8 Ultra are using different computing API benchmark standards, as the iPad is using Apple's Metal API and the S8 Ultra is using either OpenCL or Vulkan. But as you can see, the iPad Pro obliterates the Tab S8 Ultra in this benchmark as well, and that's no surprise as we know how capable Apple's GPU is inside this iPad Pro. And it's the same GPU being used to render the video you're watching right now. Geekbench ML is another benchmarking application made by the same developers, and this is used specifically to test machine learning tasks like regression, classification, clustering, object detection, and things like that. The first thing I noticed when running this benchmark is that the Tab S8 Ultra took substantially longer just to complete the benchmark to begin with, but once they both finished, you can see that the iPad Pro with M1 has more than double the CPU score for machine learning. When running the same test for the GPU, both devices completed the test in a much closer time frame and with much closer scores. The iPad Pro is still clearly ahead, but not by much, and I was honestly surprised to see these scores come in so close to one another. The last benchmark is for each tablet's respective machine learning APIs. The iPad Pro is using Core ML, and the S8 Ultra is using Neural Networks API. And this is the first test where you see the Tab S8 Ultra outperform the iPad Pro, and that's honestly surprising to see given how the iPad Pro has performed with all the other benchmarks. And Tuntu Benchmark is another commonly used benchmarking application that tests everything from the CPU to the GPU to the memory and storage. It's pretty much an all-encompassing benchmarking app that you can use to get an idea of how the whole package performs. It does all kinds of different benchmarks from H.265 video decoding to high-speed QR code recognition. And I think this is the benchmark that'll be the most telling as far as both of these devices' overall performance figures. And our results here are pretty interesting if you ask me. The iPad Pro comes in with a score of 1,205,000 versus a very respectable 931,000 from the Galaxy Tab S8 Ultra. And when looking at the different benchmark categories, you can clearly see that the iPad obviously dominates in the CPU category, but the discrepancy isn't as severe as I would have initially thought. The Snapdragon 8 is a very powerful chip, and then you can see where the iPad gets most of its lead, and that's obviously from the GPU score. It absolutely obliterates the Adreno 730, which is no surprise if we're being honest. And then we see that the Tab S8 Ultra actually outperforms the iPad Pro in the memory category, and a lot of that comes from the Tab S8 Ultra having a substantially higher random access test score. The Tab S8 Ultra also outperformed the iPad Pro for the user interface score, and it's not by much, but I was surprised to see that within the UI tests, the Tab S8 Ultra outperformed the iPad Pro for image processing and data processing, and I honestly thought the iPad would do better than the Tab S8 Ultra for those scenarios. 3D Mark is another comprehensive benchmarking application that's pretty much solely geared towards benchmarking graphical performance. This can give you a good idea of how these devices may fare for the most intensive gaming scenarios or for very graphically intensive productivity tasks. There's multiple tiers of benchmarks you can do, but just based on the power levels the app can detect, it'll automatically recommend the most extreme benchmark here for the iPad Pro. When running this benchmark on both devices, it's visually evident which device is doing the better job here. The iPad Pro is more or less pulling double the frame rate of the Tab S8 Ultra with an average of 30 FPS, which is at least a playable frame rate for a game. The Tab S8 Ultra averaged around 15 FPS, which is what I like to call Chop City. I also did an extended version of this benchmark that shows off how the tablet handles intensive graphics for longer periods of time, and you can see both devices' frame rates starting to dwindle. It's also cool that 3D Mark allows you to see how these benchmark scores rank against other devices that have done this benchmark as well, and the iPad Pro is scoring above 96% of all devices, while the Tab S8 Ultra is scoring above 76% of all devices for this benchmark. Both are respectable numbers for sure, but clearly the iPad Pro takes the cake here for graphical performance within this benchmark. GFX Bench is another intensive GPU benchmarking application that goes through dozens of different tests and in varying levels of quality to give you a general sense of the GPU's capability. And when just looking at the benchmark run, you can see that the devices seem pretty evenly matched in terms of the frame rate they maintain. But after looking at the actual results, you can see that the iPad Pro is once again superior for the most intensive graphical scenarios. And just as a side note, the GFX Bench app for Android is really buggy, and I found myself having to uninstall and reinstall the app multiple times just to get access to the menu. I think it's pretty clear which device is the more powerful tablet overall here, and it's not a shock because, like I said, the chip powering this device is the same chip that I use in my desktop computer to edit all of these videos on the channel, and it's a total shame because I think from a software perspective, the Tab S8 Ultra could do a lot more with the power that the M1 chip has. iPadOS simply doesn't deserve the M1 chip, and it's honestly an overkill processor for iPadOS at the moment. But none of this is meant to knock the Tab S8 Ultra's performance. As the 3D Mark benchmark said, this S8 Ultra is scoring above 76% of devices for that benchmark, and for everyday use, gaming, and productivity is more than enough for anyone who's looking for an ultra powerful tablet. And I must say, the battery performance of the Tab S8 Ultra really shined throughout all of these benchmarks. The Tab S8 Ultra has a slightly larger battery inside than the iPad Pro, and that was very much apparent when going through all of these tests. Overall, both devices are incredibly fast, and despite all of these benchmarks, I think a decision between these two should really be made based on software, because I think both of these devices, and specifically the iPad Pro, are truly pushing the limits of what you can even do within their respective operating systems. This iPad Pro is equipped with a 12.9-inch mini LED display, otherwise known as the Super Retina XDR display. So you're looking at a 2732 by 2048 resolution display with a 264 ppi count. You've also got P3 wide color gamut support, over 2500 full array local dimming zones, and up to 1600 nits of peak brightness for HDR content. In addition to all that, you've got 120Hz ProMotion technology, which gives you that super fluid experience. There aren't many displays at this size that offer this same level of performance at the same price as the iPad Pro. And if you haven't seen our full review of the iPad Pro, be sure to check out the card in the top right corner. The Tab S8 Ultra's display is nothing to scoff at either. What you're looking at here is a 14.6-inch Super AMOLED display. It's got an 1848 by 2960 resolution with a 240 ppi and 120Hz display. And in typical Samsung fashion, it's rocking certified HDR10 Plus support. And because of this OLED panel, the peak brightness is around 500 nits, but I've yet to get an official figure from Samsung. I think these major differences in aspect ratios on these tablets is quite a bigger deal than what you might think. If you're used to the form factor of the S series Galaxy Tabs, then it might be a bit jarring moving over to something like this iPad. And I think it's even more of an awkward transition switching to a Galaxy Tab from an iPad Pro. I feel like Samsung's trying to give this tablet a laptop-like feel with that 16:10 aspect ratio. So much so that using this massive 14-inch display in portrait mode feels quite weird, honestly. And the iPad Pro with that 4:3 aspect ratio feels much more like you're using a tablet at this size. The Tab S8 is very laptop-y, and for some people I think that may be a good thing, but it's not really something that I'm a fan of personally. With both of these devices having 120Hz capable displays, I thought it'd be good to compare which tablet has the more consistently smooth UI, because not all high refresh rate displays are built the same. And in my testing, I found that the iPad Pro is consistently smoother as far as interactions with the UI. There have been countless occasions where I'm swiping to go home or accessing the notification shade and notice a little bit of lag on the Tab S8, or what feels like lag because this is a 120Hz display. So when you're doing an animation within the UI and it looks like 30 Hz when it's normally 120, it's very noticeable. So the first of many tests is an HDR video test. This is the HDR Chroma Galaxy test, and I think this is really good for showing sharpness, blooming, and overall dynamic range as far as the HDR display capabilities. And I think definitely in the more contrasty scenes in this video, you can tell that the iPad Pro is clearly ahead. I think for a lot of the wider landscapey looking shots, you can tell that the Tab S8 just quite isn't as sharp as the iPad Pro here. The aspect ratio might have something to do with it slightly, but I think the iPad Pro just has a bit more contrast and depth to that panel. As you can see, both are capable of getting very bright, but you can clearly see that the iPad is just a bit brighter here, and I think overall that has to do with the dynamic range and peak brightness capabilities of this panel. With this Samsung Galaxy Tab S8 Ultra, you're limited to around 500 nits or so, although I'm not aware of the official brightness figure. But yeah, you're getting double the brightness here on this iPad Pro, so you're gonna see that difference. And it's hard to tell for certain scenarios, but one thing that's definitely noticeable as far as downsides on the iPad Pro is the blooming. And that's kind of a problem with mini LED panels in general. Even the $5,000 display that I have currently has a little bit of blooming issues. And that's just something that they're gonna have to work past with mini LED. But even though you are getting that pretty noticeable blooming for the iPad Pro here, I gotta say, I enjoy the image much more here on the iPad Pro overall as far as this specific piece of content goes. But I think both are doing a great job here. This is another really great piece of HDR content that I like to use for comparisons. I think this moment here in the beginning is really great for comparing the dynamic range and sharpness between these two tablets displays, and I think once again you can clearly see that the iPad Pro edges out the Tab S8 Ultra just a bit as far as dynamic range and sharpness. But I'd say this video display test is where you're gonna see the iPad Pro and Tab S8 Ultra most evenly matched as far as display capabilities. There's definitely a noticeable difference in color as far as the displays between the two. You can see that the Samsung Galaxy Tab S8 Ultra is a bit more saturated in typical Samsung fashion. The whites and blues aren't quite as natural as on the iPad Pro here. And I think the part where this guy shows up is a great part to show the differences in the reds and oranges in this display. You can clearly see it's a bit more yellowy on the Samsung panel. This scene right here is where you're going to see the iPad Pro and Tab S8 Ultra be as most evenly matched as possible. You can clearly see that Samsung calibrates their displays to be very punchy and vibrant, and I think the super punchy, vibrant, colorful scene plays well on the Samsung device just as it does in the iPad Pro. And this scene is also getting really crazy with brightness. You can tell that the iPad Pro can handle that peak brightness, that dynamic range, just a little bit better than the Tab S8 Ultra can. This is a really cool scene right here. When you see it's transformed, this sheep is transformed into this caterpillar creature. It's super colorful, really showing off the potential, how punchy and vibrant both of these displays can be. And I'd say from this video alone, if I were to only watch this video to try to compare the display capabilities between the two, it'd be very hard for me to decide which one is better. But if you really nitpick, if you really pixel peep, I'd say the iPad Pro still edges out the Tab S8 Ultra for this. Hey, that guy looks a little bit familiar. I thought it'd be good to test out one of my HDR videos just to show a real-world YouTube video playing on these devices to show the differences. And I'd say the first biggest difference that I notice is color accuracy between the two. Just because I color graded and mastered this video, I can definitely tell that the Samsung is definitely a little off. Now, there is the fact that I'm used to producing all of my videos on Apple calibrated displays, at least as far as like my MacBook Pro and stuff like that. So that might have played a part in how I perceive the color differences between these two devices for this video. But I gotta say, I think the iPad Pro, once again, just has the much more natural representation of this video as far as colors go. But I gotta say, I'm quite impressed with how well it handles brightness and the dynamic range for this particular piece of content, because I definitely pushed it as far as the nits for this video to really flex the MacBook Pro's display, as that's what I was reviewing in this video. This is one of my favorite tests to compare HDR and dynamic range display capabilities on devices. This is a NASA / LG OLED HDR test, and it's really good for comparing how well blooming or how worse blooming can be between different devices. And I gotta say, both devices really impressed me with how well they displayed this video, especially for these parts where you have the moon rotating essentially. I think the blooming was handled very well on the iPad Pro, and at certain angles it's not noticeable at all. But once again, you can clearly see there's a slight difference in colors for the whites, grays, blues as far as the display on the Tab S8 Ultra. It just looks a little bit off compared to the iPad Pro here. But as far as these punchy, vibrant colors go, I'd say the Tab S8 is definitely solid in that regard. As you see the sun shrinking here, I think it's really cool to notice which displays maintain the best black levels as more black consumes the display. And I think the iPad Pro, once again, does a slightly better job at that, but the Tab S8 Ultra, once again, no slouch as far as display performance. This, of course, is the standard HDR local dimming / blooming tests, and this is where you're going to see the iPad Pro pretty much be obliterated by the Tab S8 Ultra here. The mini LED panel, as I said, is very susceptible to bad blooming, especially in these situations where you've got this super bright white text surrounded by nothing but black. And I didn't get this iPad Pro 12.9 when it initially came out, and although I've used plenty of mini LED displays at this point, I'd never really used this one extensively until getting my hands on this Tab S8 Ultra, and I gotta say the blooming is a little bit worse than I thought it would be. And not really for tests like this, but I'd say just generally when using the UI. I think it's when you're dealing with the not so completely black levels, but the somewhat black levels, the bluish blacks, especially like when dealing with the menu, the settings menu on iOS. When you look at the tablet at certain angles, the blooming is pretty bad if you ask me. And it's something I wonder if Apple thought was worth it to include this mini LED display in this tablet, even at the cost of bad blooming. This is a pixel refresh RGB video, and I think this is a really great test for just displaying how these different tablets display different basic colors like solid reds, solid blues, solid greens. And as you can see here, the Tab S8 Ultra and iPad Pro clearly have their own slightly different interpretations of red here. But as we go through this grading of colors, I think it's very apparent how much more punchy and vibrant this mini LED panel is than the Super AMOLED display, despite me thinking that the red here on this Samsung Galaxy Tab S8 Ultra, at least for this video, is slightly more accurate than what we've got on this iPad Pro. And we can see how these two tablets interpret green. I'd say the iPad's interpretation is a bit more light, more limey than what we've got on the Tab S8 Ultra. And then when looking at this pixel refresh test, I'm just reminded of how much more screen real estate you're getting on this Tab S8 Ultra. Obviously, it's because it's a bigger device, but I think that aspect ratio allows for more to be seen when viewing standard content like YouTube videos, because it's 16:9, which is much closer than 4:3. But I'd say because of how good this iPad Pro's display is, it doesn't bother me a whole lot. Here's another test clip from Mad Max Fury Road, and we can see here that the Tab S8 Ultra definitely gives the more vivid, slightly more saturated look between the two devices. When looking at the sand in the sky and the general landscape, you can see that the Tab S8 Ultra here clearly has the more purplish kind of brown as to the more yellowish natural brown that we're getting on the iPad Pro. And I think during these flashing light scenes, the dynamic range capabilities of the iPad Pro is really flexed a lot here. I also think within this scene, the skin tones are slightly more natural on the iPad Pro than on the Tab S8 Ultra. But overall, I'm very much a fan of how this scene is looking on both of these devices. Very punchy, very vibrant, very contrasty, but in a good way. With both of these devices starting at $1099 respectively, I think both offer very capable displays, and on its own, the Tab S8 Ultra's display is very good, it's very capable, but when you put it next to the iPad Pro, it's really hard to argue against what this display brings to the table, even despite the really noticeable and sometimes bad blooming because of that mini LED panel. The iPad's blooming is pretty bad and noticeable for things even outside of HDR content, but its performance outside of that is all ahead of the Tab S8 Ultra's display, if you ask me. And I think the nail in the coffin as far as what I personally prefer to use as far as the display is the aspect ratio here on the Tab S8 Ultra. I think the 16:10 aspect ratio for a display this big is simply too awkward compared to the 4:3 that we've got on the iPad Pro. But I'd say if you don't care about the super high peak brightness and the excellent dynamic range capabilities of the iPad Pro in comparison to the Tab S8 Ultra, I'd say the Tab S8 Ultra is a great move if you were already considering it. But I think if you want the better overall display, despite it being a little bit smaller, I think the iPad Pro, if you're already considering it, is the way to go for sure. I decided to do a battery charging test to get an idea of which device takes longer to charge. The Tab S8 Ultra obviously has a much larger battery inside, but it also has over double the charging speed capability as it's capable of 45-watt charging. The iPad Pro has a smaller battery, but it's only capable of 20-watt charging, so I thought it'd be interesting to get an idea of which device takes longer. And as you can see, despite the Samsung being able to charge faster, the iPad Pro got to 100%, notably faster than the Tab S8 Ultra. Unfortunately, I thought the battery info on the iPad would be clearer to read, so it's quite hard to make out what's actually on the tablet's screen showing the percentage, but I can guarantee you that the iPad charged up much faster than the Tab S8 Ultra. I also did a battery drain test to see which device would be drained faster doing similar tasks, and I did a handful of tests, mainly using media consumption applications, and I ran each test for about an hour, and at the end of them all, the Tab S8 Ultra came out on top as expected. The battery performance of this tablet as a whole is really good and easily one of the best parts about the tablet. If you need the tablet with the best battery life, the Tab S8 Ultra is the better move between the two. Both devices feature very impressive speaker systems, loud enough to fill a quiet room and offering clarity and punch worthy of these devices' price tags, but who's got the better speaker setup? Well, I think the iPad Pro edges out the Tab S8 Ultra overall in terms of clarity and separation, but you should take a listen for yourself.
How will I stay fly when I die? I have to know. How will I still slide through your mind? I have to know. To my folk up high, folk they
A big aspect of productivity these devices are capable of comes from the S Pen and Apple Pencil. You can use both of these styluses to draw, take notes, and navigate the user interface. And so the question we want to answer is, which device offers the better overall note-taking experience? Let's start with talking about the Apple Pencil. The first major drawback here is that this pencil obviously doesn't come with the iPad Pro. It's an additional $130 cost. However, I've got some links you can check out in the description where you can get the Apple Pencil for a little cheaper or check out an alternative. But either way, this isn't something you've got to deal with on the Samsung side of things. There's no charging port of any kind for this pencil, as it charges completely wirelessly, and there's no buttons of any kind either, but you can easily replace the tip on the Apple Pencil by screwing it off and putting a new one on, which is something you can't really do on the Tab S8's S Pen. You charge the pencil by placing it on the iPad Pro's magnetic tab on the side, and the strength of this magnet is more than sufficient for normal use. The battery life of the pencil is also quite solid if you ask me. It feels like a tool that I can more or less use all day on and off. Also, another disappointing aspect of this pencil, in my opinion at least, is that you can't get it in any other color but white. And I just think a space gray Apple Pencil would be splendid, but who knows if that'll ever happen. The Tab S8 Ultra's S Pen is much closer to a stylus design than the Apple Pencil. It's notably thinner, shorter, and lighter, and like many laptop styluses, this one's got a multi-function button on it. I'd say the biggest downside to this S Pen is how you charge it. Because the Tab S8 is so freakishly thin, you have to place the S Pen on the back in a specific orientation, and if you don't have the keyboard case, this can be very inconvenient for a few different scenarios. If you simply want to place the tablet with the pen on it flat on a surface, it obviously won't lay perfectly flat, but it's not that bad as far as how it looks on a surface, but it's definitely a little awkward reaching behind the tablet to grab the S Pen, and even more so when you're putting the S Pen back on the Tab S8. The Apple Pencil from a software and customizability standpoint is pretty limited. There is a dedicated menu within iPadOS to change any settings for the Apple Pencil specifically, so the experience you've got out of the box could be enhanced for your personal use. Firstly, in the settings, you can see your battery level and can change the function of the double tap gesture, and all these quick actions are oriented for drawing and illustration apps. There's also a really useful feature that only allows the Apple Pencil to be recognized for strokes within a drawing app or note-taking application. This way you don't accidentally do something with your fingers. You can use the Apple Pencil to navigate pages within the home screen and UI, but you can't use the pencil to go home or access your control panel. And one of the more useful features of the pencil is the type to text feature. This works within note-taking applications, of course, but it also works with the address bars and messaging applications. It'll basically work within any text field, and when you want to erase the text, you simply just have to scribble it out and it disappears. This feature is called Scribble and can be enabled or disabled in the Apple Pencil settings menu. But that's more or less it as far as what you can do with this pencil in the Apple settings and with iPadOS in general, and you're going to see how much more customizable and functional the S Pen is from a software perspective. But I'd say for what iPadOS can do, the software functionality of the Apple Pencil is pretty sufficient. If you know anything about the S Pen, you know that there's a lot you can do with it in terms of software, especially with it having a physical button to program certain functions. Just like on the iPad Pro, there's an entire menu in the settings to customize your S Pen experience. There's an option to unlock your Tab S8 with the S Pen, which is certainly something the iPad Pro can't do. You can also take notes while the screen is off with a simple gesture and button combination. And this is such a nice shortcut for quickly jotting notes and sketches down, and you can do the same gesture while the screen is on. Just like on the iPad Pro, you can convert handwritten notes to typed text, and just like on the iPad, you can do this within pretty much any text field, and you can scribble it to make it go away as well. AirView is also a really cool feature that allows you to get previews for certain information within an application by hovering the S Pen over that item. For example, I can hover my S Pen over this calendar event and get a little bit more details on the event itself. And that circle you see whenever you put the pen close to the display is a digital pointer that you can disable if you'd like. Something that the Galaxy Tab and Note devices have had for the longest is the Air Command menu. This is a menu you access through the S Pen that'll give you a bunch of shortcuts to different S Pen specific features or quicker access to certain applications. You can customize the size of the Air Command menu, what apps and shortcuts are in it, and how you're able to access this menu in general. A feature that many people find convenient with the S Pen is the removal actions. You can customize what the tablet does when it detects that you've taken the S Pen off of the tablet for use. You can choose between whether opening up the Air Command menu or creating a new note. And finally, within the primary menu, you can disable feedback sounds for when you're using the S Pen, because Samsung tries to simulate the sound of a pencil or pen writing on paper, and I think it's decently effective on the Tab S8 Ultra. Take a listen. The Air Actions menu is a submenu in the S Pen settings that you can use to customize what you can do with gestures on the S Pen. You can use Air Actions to do the primary navigation functions like return home or access the recent apps menu. And of course, you can use it to access specific S Pen features or any application of your choice. As you can see here, you can do certain Air gestures and customize what those gestures do, but by default, they're set to go home, back, access the recent apps menu, access Smart Select, or do a screen scribble. But it gets even cooler because you can customize specific Air Actions within a handful of applications, mainly all of the pre-installed Samsung stuff. And being able to customize gestures for the camera app specifically is really useful, and all of this together creates a stylus experience that the Apple Pencil and iPad simply can't match. So I thought it'd be cool to just do some live drawing and live writing while talking about the experience on each device, starting with the iPad Pro here. Something I've noticed when using the Apple Pencil on any device, quite honestly, is that I feel as though, while I don't feel like I'm going to damage the display when maybe sometimes aggressively tapping the screen with the stylus here, I do feel sometimes that this stylus is just a bit too hard. It feels like it just doesn't feel good touching the display with this pencil sometimes, especially depending on the angle. And you'll get a better understanding of this once I start using the Tab S8 Ultra to compare. But I will say in general, writing with this pencil feels really good. I gotta say, in comparison to the Tab S8 Ultra, and I'll get into why, it's not quite as great, but the Apple Pencil is definitely nothing to scoff at, even though it's not included in the price of an iPad Pro or any iPad. I definitely think it performs well for everything you need it to do, writing notes and stuff like that. It just doesn't have that same exact feel of realism that the Tab S8 Ultra has, but overall, this Apple Pencil is good. I have taken many sketches with the iPad Pro before, and I gotta say, for doing this sort of stuff, it's a really fun device to use in general. My girlfriend, who's an artist, has used my iPad and used the Apple Pencil many times, and she always likes using it. As soon as she picks it up and starts drawing with it, she's immediately using it for an hour plus just because she gets so much into it. And I'll definitely say that while I enjoy the experience of the Tab S8 Ultra's stylus feel a bit more than the iPad Pro, I am definitely digging the size and feel in hand of the Apple Pencil compared to the S Pen. And I think for me personally, with the size of my hands, using a pencil or stylus of this size feels a lot more natural on a daily basis, especially when dealing with such a huge tablet. 12.9-inch tablet is not small by any means, and that's even more so the case with the Tab S8 Ultra. I'd definitely say if you were already considering getting an Apple Pencil for your iPad, then I'd say just go for it. And if you don't want the Apple Pencil exactly, the great thing about this iPad is that it's compatible with a few other brands of pencils that come in at a substantially lower price point, namely the Logitech Crayon. I'll have a link for that in the description down below. And I'll also say, after using the Tab S8 Ultra's stylus S Pen, I gotta say that I am missing that little sound feedback you get on the S Pen as far as a audible confirmation that you're writing on this display. And at first I thought the scribble sound effect on the Tab S8 Ultra was a little cheesy, but I'm honestly missing it here now that I'm going back to my iPad Pro. And now switching over to the Tab S8 Ultra with the S Pen, and I gotta say, like I said many times while using the iPad Pro, I definitely prefer the overall stylus feel, the writing and drawing feel of the S Pen a bit more than the Apple Pencil. And I decided that nearly the second that the S Pen hit the display, because just that feel, that kind of soft, I don't know really how to explain it, but that feedback you get, I feel like it's really satisfying, the feel you get when drawing with this display or writing with this display on the S Pen. The strokes just feel so seamless and so smooth when doing it here with the S Pen on the Tab S8 Ultra in a way that you just don't quite get on the iPad with the Apple Pencil. And it's quite ironic because the tip on this S Pen looks like it might be a little bit more harmful to be pricked by than the Apple Pencil, but in reality it has a much more gentle feel on the tablet's display itself than the Apple Pencil does on the iPad. And the scribble sound, I gotta say, it's something that I really enjoy. It's not something that I really thought I would enjoy as much on a tablet, but having that audible feedback on the device when, writing something out or drawing something out, it's really satisfying, and it just enhances the overall note-taking experience. And it's cool that you can turn it off if you don't want it. Being able to have that option is great. When I had both of these tablets facing up to face the camera and kind of hovering over the tablets, writing on them to kind of clearly demonstrate what I'm doing on camera, I gotta say, I enjoyed doing that much more on the S Pen than with the Apple Pencil. And I think that friction and tip feel plays a huge part in that. And while I did bring up the size of the Apple Pencil and stated that I do like the size of that a bit more than the S Pen, and while that is true, I do feel as though the general size of this stylus is very much sufficient for the size of this display. I think if they made it a little bit larger, it'd be even more awkward sitting on the back side of the display. So I think they kind of nailed the size perfectly with the options they had. And I don't know if you've been able to notice, but I feel as though in general, my handwriting comes out a lot cleaner on this Galaxy Tab S8 Ultra than it does on the iPad. I don't know if that's a software thing that's kind of like enhancing the appearance of the handwriting in comparison to the Apple Notes app, but I feel as though it's just better and easier, feels better in general to use the S Pen with the Galaxy Tab S8 Ultra. I don't know if that has anything to do with the finish of the display on the Tab S8 Ultra itself any more so than it is just the feel of the tip on this stylus, but I gotta say, for purely note-taking, the Tab S8 Ultra is the winner here. All the software features, all of the customization, all of the functionality that you get through the S Pen and Android simply just blows the iPad out of the water. And while Apple does have a chance to kind of get the Apple Pencil to catch up in years to come, that's definitely not going to happen within at least the next 2 or 3 product generations. I think they got a lot of catching up to do before the Apple Pencil experience is anywhere near the S Pen experience. The Apple Pencil is great, don't get me wrong, and if you need to note take on your Apple iPad, I gotta say the Apple Pencil is great, but especially given the fact that this S Pen comes with this Galaxy Tab S8 Ultra, you don't have to spend an extra $130 to acquire this note-taking utensil. I gotta say, it's the better deal, it offers the better experience for technically less money. If I were impartial to operating systems and just wanted a huge tablet to take high quality notes on and just have a high quality tablet device, and note-taking was my biggest priority, Tab S8 Ultra for sure. Let's talk about optional keyboards you can get for these tablets from Samsung and Apple. They're both priced at $349, and it's simply no contest as far as what's the better accessory for the money. The Apple Magic Keyboard feels more premium, is easier to use, and has a better typing feel for me personally. The Magic Keyboard comes in one piece, and you mount your iPad by aligning it with the magnetic charging points on the back. The Magic Keyboard uses a very strong hinge that allows for vertical articulation without a kickstand of any kind, and the keyboard's got a USB-C charging port for more convenient charging. The Ultrabook cover keyboard comes in 2 separate pieces, a plate for the back and then the keyboard itself. The back plate serves mainly as a kickstand for the tablet while using the keyboard, but it also has a compartment to hold the S Pen while it's magnetically attached to the tablet. Just like the Magic Keyboard, it's backlit, but that's probably its best feature as a keyboard. The accessory as a whole feels very flimsy for what you're paying, and the key travel in comparison to the Magic Keyboard isn't very good if you ask me. The trackpad on the Tab S8 Ultra's keyboard is substantially larger than on the Magic Keyboard, but once again I feel as though the Magic Keyboard has the better tracking feel and response compared to the Ultrabook cover. Using the trackpad for gestures on the Tab S8 feels very stiff and awkward compared to Apple's gestures, which feel a lot more fluid and natural. Overall, if you're looking for the better tablet to use with a keyboard attachment, the iPad Pro's got it all day, and it's honestly not even close. There are so many different aspects of these tablets that each device dominates in. Obviously, the M1 iPad Pro is the performance king and has a much more interesting display if you ask me. And then the Tab S8 Ultra crushes the iPad Pro for battery life, expandability, and note-taking feel. Only you can ultimately decide which tablet's going to work better for you, but I hope this video helped in making that decision a little easier. Both tablets are fantastic in their own way, and either one is going to be great as an ultra-powerful performance tablet. If you want to check out either tablet or their accessories, there will be links for that in the description down below where you can check that out. And if you enjoyed this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up and subscribe for future content like this. Thanks for watching, and I'll talk to you guys in the next one.